Turning now to education in the state school reform office is moving ahead with a controversial plan to hire a CEO to turn around failing schools. 4 schools in East Detroit are first on the list. Critics say this approach is not the answer. It gives too much power to one person. But others point to the success of the CEO model in Massachusetts, which now has the top performing schools in the nation. You know, I think this is really interesting because when we talk about education in Michigan and making sure our education in the state is better, we're talking about improving test scores. We're talking about going into schools and looking at the curriculum there. And so when you see the school reform office, many people still don't quite understand that it is not part of the Michigan Department of Education, that the governor moved it a year ago.
For good reason.
And so, all right.
Backdooring.
Okay, so hang on. We've got a backdooring and we've got a good reason. So I'm going to start with you, Nolan, and I want you to tell me why it was a good reason that the governor took the reform powers for schools and moved it away from the Department of Education.
So we keep talking in Michigan about being a top 10 education state. We're now a bottom 5 education state. We're getting worse instead of better. And we compare ourselves or our aspirations to Massachusetts, for example. You mentioned that has done this and done it effectively. Tennessee, Florida, Colorado, all states which have made great progress. And we say, well, why can't we do that? And we start talking about models of schools and who runs schools. And the basic problem here in this state is we do not have any sort of unified commitment to make the schools better. We have a bifurcated system where the State Board of Education and the superintendent are over here and independent and basically run by the unions. And over here you have the governor and his education agenda and the legislature with their education agenda. There's no unity, there's no agreement, there's been no commitment yet to saying, here's where we want to be, here's how we're going to get there, and we're all going to pull together. That's what happened in Tennessee. That's what happened in Massachusetts. That's what happened in Florida, Maryland. That's how it got done. It will never happen here as long as we fight over turf and as long as the system is so chopped up and there's no direct accountability.
So are you saying that there should not be a Michigan Department of Education, an elected school board, or a superintendent? You believe that all of that should be controlled by the governor's office?
I think the governor should be accountable for all of that.
Well, so there are other states, though, that are doing a lot better that don't have that model. Maryland's a great example. The state superintendent and the board in Maryland are similarly sort of separated and independent from the governor's office. There's good reasons for that. You don't want a political actor to be entirely in charge without some other check of education. And so there's a reason to insulate some of that stuff from the political process. That's not our problem. Our problem is what Nolan is talking about here is this is sort of lack of commitment. And the lack of commitment is on both sides, by the way. It's not just the state board and the superintendent. It's also the governor and the legislature. They are ideologically driven. They believe, they have deeply held philosophy that they think will work. There's no proof that it works. They're not willing to use metrics to judge what they're doing. They just want to go ahead and do it. And that's what this school reform office was about. It was about backdooring this ideological push to make schools look a certain way because that's what they believe they should look like.
What that was about was a frustration with the fact that the MDE, the Michigan Department of Education, and that state school board absolutely have no commitment to reforming schools or to making dramatic change in schools. If you look at the things that the governor has proposed, these are the very things that are working in those places.
Some of them
you're talking about. Those places have stronger teacher accountability. They have stronger principal accountability. They have a more direct oversight over funding and what have you. And what we want in Michigan, what so far the process has been controlled by people who say, just give us more money and let us keep doing things the same way.
Oh. But I think you look at this reform board and people can get confused and say, wow, this looks exactly like emergency management. If you put a CEO in charge, it's exactly like emergency management. So tell me how it's going to differ and how it's going to be any less of a controversy than emergency management has been in this state.
It's similar, but I mean, it's more of a CEO running an individual school. It's more of a appointed principal than it is a district emergency manager. I don't know if it's going to work or not. It certainly didn't work. This was very similar to the EAA, and that didn't work. I don't think anything's going to work in this state until first. I mean, we blame the politicians and the unions and what have you until we get some sort of commitment from parents as well. There's not been an outcry in this state, to where there was in Tennessee and Florida and even Massachusetts, that we need to do better, coming from the parents, coming from the people whose children are being cheated. I mean,
what kind of outcry would you like to see? What do you think that you need to see? Because I talk to a lot of parents. My kids are in schools who are not pleased with what's going on. And this week actually starts the M steps. By the way, you've got kids in school right now, which is a totally different measurement of of kids how are doing. But what would you say would constitute a push by the parents? What do you want to see?
Those parents you talk to, how much time do they take before they go in and vote in a school board election to figure out who they're voting for? I mean, it's the least participated election, and people have no knowledge of who they're elected. Parents got to care more about what's going on in their schools, and they have to demand better from the people they elect to lead the schools. I think in Michigan, you look at the polling, people think their schools are just fine, and meanwhile, the test results show we are among, not just urban schools, suburban schools, outstate schools, rural schools, as a whole, we are among the worst performing states in the country.
I think also a big concern is what you just said is a couple minutes ago is the lack of connectedness, that it feels like there's not one similar plan or page that everyone's on, that you've got the MDE operating over here, and now you're going to have the Governor's Reform Office, and you know that while everyone wants to make Michigan great again, that there's competing interests here.
Yeah, there are, and again, the interest of the governor and the legislature here is purely ideological. If you look at the money that is coming into their pockets from GLEP, from the charter school lobby, from the DeVosses who fund GLEP also, but also directly fund these legislators, I mean, it's essentially controlling the conversation from that side. And look, that's the way politics works, but it is an ideological belief that they are pursuing. It is not a standard of excellence that they're sitting out and saying, well, this is what we're going to achieve. They're saying this is the way things have to be done. They have to be done like business. They have to open up to charters, unregulated charter environment. And look, that's not worked. That's not worked for 20 years in this state, and we've tried that. It's as much of a failure as the public school system was. And so to say that it's the unions and the MDE and not cast equal blame on the other side is part of the problem.
Meanwhile, the MDE, the Democratic board members that control the Michigan Department of Education, call the unions the funders, and they do nothing without approval by those unions. That is not where reform.
So you got both sides held captive.
That's not where reform
interest
is going to come from. You've got to get a uniform strategy, and you have to get a uniform commitment. In Tennessee, the business community led it. They said, enough of this. These schools are holding our state's growth back, our potential back. You look what's happened in the schools there and correspond it to what's happening with the economic growth in that state. It's phenomenal.
So you think it's going to take the business leaders to do some kind of push, some K
I think you're starting to see them involved more, or starting to figure out how to get involved. But nobody wants to touch this because it is such a political tar baby, and we've never been able to come to any sort of consensus.
Well, unfortunately, it's because in politics you can't admit it's all got to be your side or nothing. Well, there is no give and take. So
exactly.
Then let me ask you this then. So if Michigan does want to be the top 10 state again, we had Brian Whiston on here at the beginning of the school year saying, I've got this plan that we want to make Michigan get to be a top 10 state, and he's the state superintendent. Yeah. Who gives, I guess, in this conversation?
So you've got to have somebody who starts championing excellence and measured excellence as opposed to their side, and the governor's as guilty as anybody of not doing that. He's championing one side of the political equation and not saying, well, look, even if you want to pursue that side, let's put some infrastructure in place to make sure that it achieves what it's supposed to achieve, and when it doesn't, let's admit that it's failed and go do something else.
Oh, no one wants to admit failure, though, no one, right?
Well, I mean, I think he's come to admit failure with the EAA, but I mean, I think it's more
emergency management, EAA. He hasn't done anything that's really worked. Right?
I think what we have here and what we have to get to here is a recognition that our schools aren't what they were 30 years ago. And Michigan still thinks their schools, I mean, they scoffed at Mississippi for the longest time. Our schools now are no better than Mississippi's, and Mississippi's are headed this way while ours are headed that way. There are models out there we know work. There are other states that are doing things we could do here, but we haven't yet decided that that's what we want to do.
All right, and now to